All right, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our final speakers for this afternoon, we have a special speaker in her own right, Jennie Churchill.
When heckled by the suffragettes, Winston Churchill famously said that he would not be henpecked. But the truth is that, like most men, he was dependent on women for his success. It was his mother, my namesake and great-grandmother, Jennie Churchill, who launched his career using her networks to get him the newspaper commissions that first made his name and allowed him to turn his sword into a dispatch box. It was his wife, Clementine, who ensured that his homes accommodated his eccentric routine of work, and who he turned to in times of real crisis for support and advice. It was his daughters and granddaughters who accompanied him on his many travels, and it was his secretaries who turned his flow of words into the vital speeches, minutes, memos, and books on which actions depended. I am delighted that we have two of those key women here today. They will already be known to most of you. First, we have Celia Sandys. Celia got to know her grandfather well as a teenager and accompanied him on many of his last great adventures. She sailed with him on the Onassis yacht Christina and escorted him back from France in the specially converted RAF jet after a bad fall in 1962. But she also has established herself as a leading authority on her grandfather, proving that the literary genes pass equally well down the female line, and has written and presented on Winston's childhood, military adventures, and worldwide travels. Celia will be in conversation with Lady Williams, who, as the young Jane Portal, worked as a secretary for Churchill between 1949 and 1955. She was a first-hand witness to the key period that saw him return to 10 Downing Street and serve his second term as Prime Minister. For those of you who watched The Crown, she was actually there and can tell you what it was really like. I am delighted to introduce them both. They have already done so much to ensure that the record is kept green and accurate, and we are honoured that they are here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. David, we have that light down. David, could we have that light dimmed? It's really dreadful. Thank you. Well, I'm particularly thrilled to be here with Jane, who over the last few years has become one of my closest friends, and very happy because I have childhood memories of her from a long way back. When I was a child, she seemed to be the glamorous creature escorting my grandfather and always around the place at Chartwell or at Chequers or at Hyde Park Gate. I also heard a lot about her because my nanny, who was my Mrs. Everest, was great friends with the nanny of the children of Rab Butler, who was in my grandfather's cabinet. And so the two nannies, because they were friends, I was friends with Rab Butler's daughter, Sarah. And my nanny, being in the position that she was, she heard lots of things and knew lots of secrets that she couldn't tell anyone. But she could tell Nanny Butler because she knew she was in the same position. So they were all chatting away. If only I could have taken it all down, I would be able to tell you lots more interesting things. But so I'm thrilled here to be with Jane and to hear, what she's got to tell you. She's got wonderful stories, and she was there and the fly on the wall, and not just the fly on the wall, she was the active participant of all that was going on at this time. She is living history. Jane, how did it happen that you got that extraordinary job?
Well, I could come to that, but first, thank you so much for those words, because we are great friends, and it's a friendship I treasure. Because I remember you running round the garden at Chartwalk. From the office, we could see out to the lawn in front, and Winston Churchill saying, "There goes my little redhead." And this was the first time I sort of felt that I'd got to know him, and that was many, many years ago. So the way I got the job was what would be considered totally improper, which was I was brought up by my uncle, Rab Butler, who was, as you know, Churchill was at that time leader of the opposition, in the Conservative Party opposition, having lost the election in 45. And Rab was putting together a new policy for the Conservative Party in the research department. So I was living with him. I'd just done a secretarial course. I'd been told I was not bright enough to go to university, and so that made me didn't make me sad, thank goodness, it made me rather angry. And so Rab came home one night and said, I've been with Winston at Hyde Park Gate, and he's writing his war memoirs, and they're so overworked there. There are only 3 secretaries, so they're looking for another secretary. And he said, "Why don't you try?" He said, "I mentioned your name to them. You can go and have an interview tomorrow." So I got into my best suit and went along to Hyde Park Gate. And the Churchill family, as most of you probably know, they had got 2 houses in a lovely cul-de-sac near Kensington Gardens, 28 Hyde Park Gate, where they lived. Then there was a passage through to 27 Hyde Park Gate, where we had the offices, and Churchill had his London painting studio, looking out onto the garden. And I so well remember that day, standing at the end of the connecting passage between the 2 houses, and suddenly I looked round, and there was Winston Churchill in his House of Commons clothes, striped trousers, black coat, getting ready to go to the House of Commons. And he walked down the passage towards me. And I'd been a child brought up in the war. We'd all listened to his speeches, and he was the great, iconic hero of all time. And he walked towards me, put out his hand, shook my hand, walked very slowly all the way around me, and smiled at me, and walked away. And Jo Sturdy, who was the head secretary, head of the 3, she'd been a garden room girl in the war. She was only 26 at that time. But she was a marvellous person, formidable. And she said to me, "Good, that's all right. Can you begin on Monday?"
Well, that wasn't a very full interview, was it? I think, as Jennie mentioned about The Crown, but last night we saw that wonderful film, and in it there was a very frightened secretary who was Elizabeth Leighton.
Yes.
And she showed us how scary it was to be my grandfather's secretary. How did you feel about it?
I was absolutely trembling with fear. And I remember the first real occasion, because when I started, Jo Sturdy, the great Jo Sturdy, I called her the head girl, she said to me, the way to learn a new job, is to do the filing. So there's a huge amount of filing in the muniment room, the bottom of Hyde Park Gate. So you go down there and get started. Well, I was very happy there, but I was there for 3 months. And then one day, she came down looking very flustered to the muniment room and said, you know, I don't know what we're going to do, because Mr. Churchill, as he was then, is making a big speech on foreign affairs in the House of Commons. He should be on his feet at 3 o'clock. It's now 11 o'clock in the morning, and he's still dictating. And I don't know how we're going to get him there. And so she said, you'll have to go up and take dictation. And he had his bedroom, as you would remember, on the first floor at Hyde Park Gate. And I remember walking up the stairs, trembling. I opened the door, and there was Winston Churchill in his bed, huge bed, in his red brocade dressing gown, with Rufus the poodle at one end of the bed, and Cap the other end of the bed. And as I went in, he looked up, and with quite a benign, kind look, but a look of total despair, he said to me, isn't there anybody else? And I fled. I rushed down the stairs, and I said, and Jo Sturdy, with her flashing blue eyes, and she did what I expect some of you have maybe done. I've done it with small people who I've lost control of. She took me by the bicep, and she marched me up the stairs. It was rather like when you fall off your pony and you're told you've got to get on again. She rushed me up the stairs. She flung open the door, and she said to him, there is nobody else. And then, and this is partly the point of my story, because I wanted to describe to you a person who was so wonderfully, genuinely kind. He didn't want to upset people. I never found that, ever. Although the rage sometimes was something else. But he picked up he said to me, my dear, come and sit down. And I sat down, and he dictated in that great Churchill voice a very short piece of dictation. Go and do it, bring it back. When I brought it back, he held up this piece of A4 paper on which I typed 10 lines. And he said, this is the most excellent piece of work, and now you may go. So you see, he'd won. And I went, and as I went down the stairs and got to the office, Jo Sturdy, I was smiling, I was happy. She said to me, I see you've allowed him to be nice to you. And I like to think that whatever happened for the next 6 years, he was nice to me. There were moments when, through his own frustration, the pressure of work, and he would fly off the handle. And the only thing to do was to go away and come back, and it would never be referred to, but there'd be some gesture of forgiveness, because it was usually my fault, honestly. It was something I'd forgotten, or he was being persecuted about something. And so it was always all right.
Well, he used to say to us, never let the sun go down on your wrath.
Oh,
and
did
so I
he?
think he was practicing what he preached. But this wasn't a normal 9-to-5 job, was it?
It's far from it. And as I said, I was the fourth person. Chips Gemmell and Barry, I'm so sorry that Chips is not here. She lives in New York. She's the same age as me. And she worked at Chartwell at Westram, lived in Westram, and then came to London when he became Prime Minister and worked for your grandmother, for Lady Churchill. But so in the London office were 4 of us. And of course his working hours were so remarkable. You see, if I may tell you a typical day, he would wake up at 7:30 in the morning. The valet would bring his breakfast, simple breakfast. He would start work with one of us at 9 o'clock. He'd work in bed till lunchtime, unless there was an engagement. Usually he'd work in bed till lunchtime. Then he'd go to the House of Commons in the afternoon. Somewhere in that time, he'd have an hour's sleep. And somehow he could go to sleep just like that for an hour. He'd wake up and he'd have the rest of the day. But then the real work began after dinner, 10:30, 11 o'clock. And it would go on till 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was one reason I was told I'd been chosen, was that I looked young, strong, and healthy. I could do this monumental workload.
So when you were working, you were between the houses. Did you prefer being at Chartwell or at Chequers or at Hyde Park Gate?
Well, of course, he was not at... Chequers was not available till he became Prime Minister in 1951. 1949-50, he was finishing his war memoirs. When I got there in 1949, he was on volume 4. And he had this extraordinary intuition about events in life, you know. Everybody will tell you that, who knows about Winston Churchill. And he felt sure that he had a job to do. It was the theme. Somebody this morning mentioned theme. I think it was David Owen. And that he could bring peace between the East and the West. And that his aim, his theme, was a meeting with the Soviet Union. He felt he would be able to talk to Stalin and to bring in the Americans. At that time it was Truman. Later it was Eisenhower, which gave him extra confidence that he could do it. And so that when he became Prime Minister after 2 elections, 1950, Conservatives lost again. Labour had a majority of 6. No one can govern with a majority of 6. And so it was 18 months later, another election, and the Conservatives won October 1951. And Churchill was Prime Minister again. And he took Elizabeth Gilliard and myself as his personal, what he always called us his young ladies. It was so sweet, his young ladies, or Miss if he couldn't, because then he didn't have to remember who he was talking to. and he took 2 of us to Downing Street. So that's when, also the workload there was different, but it was just as heavy. And he'd finished the war memoirs by then. But there was anybody who, and that I'm so well aware, as I speak to you, of the historians and politicians and academics who are in this room, who know the history so much better than me. But I feel that what I want to talk about, and Celia has so sweetly enabled me to do it, is about the person, the human being that I worked for. And so it's not an academic talk, my talk at all. But no, when you say, I prefer Chartwell or Chequers, I love Chartwell. And Liz Gilliard, my colleague, she loved Chequers. So it worked out very well. And it was agreed with the government, the chief whip and everybody, that Churchill would go to Chequers every other weekend. And that enabled him to have Chartwell every other weekend. But on the Chequers weekends, we'd go down always on a Thursday, and on Saturday, we would drive to Chequers. But, see, am I going on too much?
Not at all, no. That's what
I
we
want to tell you about the journey to Chartwell, because as everybody knows, Chartwell was so precious to him. He felt the burdens of the world life were lifted from his shoulders when he went to Chartwell. And so that we would go on a Thursday. This was routine. That was unless we were abroad or something like that. But usually the journey was from the House of Commons on Thursday about 4 o'clock. And as Churchill, you know his love of the language. This was why he had to dictate he always had one of us running around behind him. If he was walking, he'd be dictating. If he was sitting down, there'd be somebody there. He was always speaking the English language with which he was in love. And so I'd get into the cart with him at the House of Commons. We'd have the black box. There was this endless business of the government boxes that had to be coped with and dealt with. That would be on the seat in front of me. And we'd call in at number 10, and Rufus the poodle would join us and sit on the armrest, and he would dictate. And in those days, you see, I have to remember, nobody here is old enough, but we live in a different age now. There were no motorways, there were no mobiles, there were no computers, there was nothing. It was a different world. It was a lovely world, but a lovely world now, in this different way. But that's why he wanted this dictation, because there was no other way. And there was no motorway, we'd go via Crystal Palace to Chartwell. And on the corner of Crystal Palace, there was an evening standard news vendor. Now, I have to tell you, anybody who's read Boris Johnson's book on Churchill, Boris Johnson takes this story. Well, sorry, Boris, it's my story. And with this newspaper vendor would put the Evening Standard through the window of the car to him, and he would have smoked about half a cigar by Crystal Palace. So he would take the half cigar, rather sodden, and give it to the newspaper vendor. And I can remember this happening every Thursday, and I could see the face of this lovely man. And I often wondered, what did he do with them? I mean, did he smoke them? Or did he put them in a bag and in a box and keep them to give to his grandchildren? Doesn't matter.
Or did he sell them?
Well, that's what somebody once said. I'm sure he didn't sell them. You know, anybody, I say this straight away, anybody who worked closely with Winston Churchill is quite incapable of being objective. We adored him. We would do anything for him. We worked night and day. We were happy. I remember Chips Gemmell, who was 1 year older than me, and we were often alone at Chartwell. And I remember her once saying to me, I don't know how he puts up with us. And because we were young, we were chattering, we were giggling, but there was the serious work as well. So that was Chartwell.
But at Chartwell also, there were always films, weren't there?
Oh, there were films. Now, I believe is it the grandson of Alexander Calder here? No.
Michael Calder, is
Michael
he?
Calder.
No, he's apparently
not here.
not
Well,
here.
anyway, this is Alexander Calder, as you know, was a great friend of Churchill from the 30s. And Alexander Calder had been with them at Chartwell having lunch. And he'd said to Winston Churchill, you know, I'm so anxious for you because you're always dictating to a secretary. You're never at leisure. You're never with your family. And I think the family nodded. Yes, no, he's very seldom with us because he's always working. And Alexander Calder said, there's a wonderful invention. It's called a dictaphone. And I would like to give you a dictaphone. And I will send it over, and we'll get somebody to install it. We'll probably install it, and it was discussed, shall we install it in your bedroom? Because that's where you do a lot of your work. It's near the study. And so where he did also a great deal of work. And so the builders came in, you have no idea. They took down one half of his, Zoe here, she would know the bedroom, they took down one half of the bathroom and put a great cupboard with this dictaphone in it. And then the family got him at lunch and said, now, tonight you'll be able to have dinner with us. Miss Portal can take the tape. All you have to do is to speak into it during the day. Press a button, it's done. She takes the tape and types it out. So no work tonight. And so then I went off and had fun somewhere. And next morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, banging on my bedroom door, the detective saying to me, Mr. Churchill wants you immediately. I go up, and he says to me, take it away. He said, I don't like it. I can never work like this. I must be able to dictate, to hear the English language as I speak it, and not to a machine. I don't want a machine. So it was removed. So I said, well, now we'll write to Sir Alexander Corder. Yes, and he wrote a lovely letter. And it came back straight away. You see, no emails, nothing like that. It came back straight away from Alexander Corder, an airmail letter saying, I entirely understand your views about the dictaphone, but I do want to give you a gift, a substantially good gift. So I'm going to give you a cinema. And that is how the cinema came into being. And by sheer wonderful chance, there was living in Westram Mr. Shaw, who'd been a cinema projectionist all his life, retired. He used to come and show the films at the weekends. We'd have 3 films every week. You used to probably see them.
Oh, yes, it was lovely, and there was wonderful aroma. I mean, my childhood memory of smell is of Napoleon brandy and Havana cigars, which the whole cinema smelt of. It was wonderful.
Yes.
And then he'd say, let it roll.
Let it roll, yes. And you see, as you all know, he loved certain films. He liked historic films. He loved Vivian Leigh. He loved, so we had Lady Hamilton many times. Alexander Corder had all the films in his office in London, and one of my jobs was to choose the films. He also liked films about animals, because he loved animals. He loved his family above everything, and lots of other things, but he loved animals. And I remember one film I chose, I don't know if you saw it, was about a white grey stallion in France. And a little boy rescued it. It was wild. And the story ends terribly. The horse was shot by wicked people. And you know how Churchill wept? And he came out and he summoned me. And he said to me, how could you? And I said, I'm crying too, you know. And so I had to be careful. But the cinema is still there, isn't it? It's for everybody to see.
So tell me, Jane, did you used to travel with him a lot?
Yes.
Where did you go?
We went to Marrakesh, of course, quite often. And Lord Beaverbrook lent him this wonderful villa in the south of France, La Capucina. Spent many times there. And because wherever he went, one of us was with him. I mean, keeping quiet, I hope.
And all your equipment went too, didn't it?
Oh, our equipment in great vans. We had these huge, great typewriters, which are in the Churchill Museum now. They were called silent typewriters. They were silent, but they were huge, big as that. And so we took that with us. I went, I think, 3 or 4 times with him to America, to Washington. First of all, he went to see Truman, and then 3 times to see Eisenhower, because his whole aim was this peace that he was going to be able to organise and get started between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. Stalin died in 1953, and so he was then, the Foreign Office were absolutely horrified by this. And by the way, the Prime Minister was taking over the Foreign Office. And, but nevertheless, we went 3 times.
Did you fly or did you go by sea?
We went once on the Queen Mary, yes, for 51.
But when you flew, do you remember how they used to have the notice where they said no pipes or cigars? And whenever I flew him, they'd just say no pipes and he would be able to puff away.
Oh, Celia. No, I don't remember that.
I think he'd have puffed away anyway.
He just puffed away.
Because in the war, when he had to wear an oxygen mask, he said he'd only wear it if he could have the mask adapted so he could smoke at the same time, which sort of defeated the object.
Were they able to already?
Yeah, they were, yes, they were.
So,
how, with all this going on, did you manage to have any social life at all? Because you were very young.
well, I know. I was also very spoilt and selfish, actually. And I had lots of friends. And I don't know if there's anyone. I did manage to get to some parties, and I'd go back after the party and work.
In your ball gown or
Well, you know, we had the wonderful atmosphere, this was number 10, where the telephonists knew all about our private lives and helped us no end. And I would say to one of the lovely telephonists, I'm going to be dancing at the 400 in Leicester Square. I don't suppose anybody here is old enough to remember the 400.
Well, I am, and Edwina is. We've been there. Lovely.
But I'd say, ring this number and say, will Miss Portal ring her mother urgently? And I could be from Leicester Square to Downing Street in 20 minutes in my dress. And the messengers on the door at Downing Street were wonderful. They were war veterans. And in those days, you see, Downing Street has been rebuilt again and again, I think twice. There was no press office. I believe the press office went beside the door. Now it's somewhere quite different. But the war veterans used to say to me, everything's ready for you, Miss Portal. Just leave your dress, we'll hang it up. And I would rush up to the cabinet room, and he'd be sitting at the cabinet room table reading the first editions of the next day's papers, because a car used to go along Fleet Street, which was where all the newspapers were in those days, and get the first editions.
But that was very nice, because we used to get that at Chartwell too, before we went to bed.
Oh,
We'd
did
be able
you?
to take the next day's papers to bed with us. So
Well, how did you get hold of
well, I
them?
think they drove them down from London.
Oh, they probably did. Yes. But he loved that. And people have said to me, where was the Prime Minister's study? Where did he work? Well, in the mornings he worked in his bedroom, and except when there was a cabinet meeting, probably twice a week. And otherwise, he always worked at the cabinet room table with the telephone beside him. And I remember he used to, when I got there, he'd say, get the night editor of the Daily Express. And I'd have all the numbers, and I'd ring up and I'd say, the Prime Minister would like to speak to you. And you could hear the gasp of horror at the other end of the phone. And then he'd go through the paper with them. Say, you got this wrong, or I like this. And so the evenings were full of fun.
And we were there when, of course, when George VI died and the Queen became Queen.
Yes, indeed. I remember Edward Ford, Private Secretary, coming to tell the Prime Minister at 8 o'clock in the morning that George VI had died in the night. And as you know, the new young Queen was to come back from Kenya, where she was, and Churchill was to broadcast, this was a couple of days later, Churchill was to broadcast to the nation that night. And of course his meticulous way of writing speeches and broadcasts, it was so, I'm like Mrs. May, aren't I?
No, not quite. No, but anyway, you're doing very well. I think everyone's very appreciative of you. I think you're having a better ride than she did.
I mean, I'm sorry, the coughing. But anyway, where did I got to?
You were talking about the Queen and being...
The Queen. And he started his broadcast in the morning, and he took such enormous trouble with it, and then it wasn't right and he had to go on. So the new young Queen was due at what was then London Airport at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and he still hadn't finished at 3 o'clock when he was to leave to go and meet her. And so I was sent in the car to take down the corrections, the remainder of the broadcast. And when we got there, the aeroplane had arrived. And the cabinet was lined up. You may have seen the photograph. There's a wonderful photograph of the cabinet of the day with Churchill's broad figure at the top, the elegant Anthony Eden, and so on, down the line, back view. And they were all waiting at the foot of the steps. And the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden's private secretary, Evelyn Shuckburgh, was there. And he said to me, look, this is a historic moment. We've got to see it. So we went and hid behind an aeroplane just next door. And I shall never forget this beautiful young Queen. She was so lovely, she is now, but she was such a beautiful girl, coming out on the steps of the aeroplane. She had no hat on, her hair was blowing in the wind, and she walked down the steps, so slender, and shook the hands of her her cabinet. And then we got back in the car, and he didn't say a word the whole way back. He just wept. And I think he felt it was terribly. It was so historic and so romantic.
Well, he sort of was in love with her, wasn't he?
Yes.
What's your view of his relationship with her?
Well, it was so close and so wonderful and so right and proper. You know, he had this great love of history. And I'm sure he was thinking of Lord Melbourne, you know, and the young Queen Victoria. But he felt it was his duty to guide her, and she obviously loved him. And so every Tuesday evening, I think it's still Tuesday evenings, the Prime Minister goes to see the Queen, and he would go, and other times too.
But I think a lot of people here will have seen The Crown, and in The Crown there was one incident which I thought was absolutely, you know, I didn't like, and it wouldn't have happened, is one stage he kissed her on the forehead.
No.
You'd never have done that, would you? No. Now, to move on to another film, which has portrayed him, the famous Stroke.
Yes.
You were there then, weren't you?
Yes. As you all know, it's been the De Gasperi dinner, great dinner for the President of Italy, Carmen. Churchill had made a marvellous speech on the Roman conquest. And then it was only apparent to Christopher Sims and Jock Colville that something had happened. He had a stroke there that dinner. And they got him up to bed, and the next day, Jock was with him, and doctors arrived. He insisted on taking a cabinet meeting, and I asked my Uncle Rab, who'd been there, how was he? He said nobody noticed. The only thing was he was very quiet. And then he said, I want to go to chapel. And by then, the stroke was taking effect, the paralysis was growing. But he got to Chartwell, and another film.
Did you see that film where there was the one,
Well,
do you
the
remember
wonderful-
the nurse got into bed with him? Do you remember that?
Oh, dear. And you see, Michael Gambon is one of the great actors of all time, so wonderful. But he didn't get that right. It was a badly produced film. I got in, they asked me to give them advice about various things, and I had to give it up because, you see, you remember with your mother and her sisters and Mary.
They made them all that they were at war all the time.
That they were, well, the family was at war, and that everyone was drinking the whole time because they were all so upset. There was, in point of fact, there was a feeling of absolute calm and peace at Chartwell. Were you there?
No, but I remember a lot of sort of anguished conversations going on back
Yes.
in London.
Yes, but actually there, and of course it was then, I think it was the Thursday, and I remember Lord Warren said the paralysis was growing, and he was up in his bedroom at that point. And Lord Warren and the doctors said they didn't think he'd last the weekend. So then the question is, what do you do? He's the Prime Minister. Well, the Queen was informed immediately, of course, and then the wonderful Secretary to the Cabinet, Norman Brooke, informed the Cabinet, and it was decided, and he was absolutely adamant about it, because he hadn't achieved his goal, which was this meeting with, by then Stalin was dead, but with Molotov, he was determined that before he gave up the premiership, he would be able to start the peace process between the East and the West. That was his whole obsession. And so that no way was he going to give up. And it was agreed with everybody that at the top there that a statement was issued saying the Prime Minister needed a rest after the coronation, which had taken place earlier. Anthony Eden had been desperately ill, so Churchill had also been doing the Foreign Secretary's job, which he loved, but it was a lot of work, and he was exhausted. So anyway, that was June, the second half of June, 53. And he was in his bed at Chartwell, and I was there the whole time. And we set up reading somewhere to put his book, because his arm, by then he was paralyzed down the left side. And he started reading. He was never, for what his recovery and his attitude during that terrible time of severe illness was heroic. There was not one word of self-pity, not one complaint. He did what the doctors told him to do, and he stayed quietly in bed, and he read Trollope's political novels on this reading table. And I remember he couldn't by then turn the page. And I remember we took it in turns to sit by his bed. And I find this so moving, you see. When he got to the end of the page, he blinked, and we would turn the page over for him. And it was extraordinary how much book you got through. And also, he was at peace, you know, in some extraordinary way. He would sit just looking, completely conscious, his mind was absolutely clear. And he was thinking about this goal, this achievement that he must make before he could go, before he could die. He must bring peace to the world. This person who had the reputation among so many people of being a warmonger, all he was dreaming of after the war was peace in the world. And the great difficulty it was going to be for the Americans and the Soviet Union.
But he'd set himself a goal.
It was
also.
his goal.
But he set another goal that he had to do the Margate speech.
Yes,
didn't
he knew that the Conservative Party, quite understandably, would say it was time he went. And indeed, there was plotting going on. I can't describe to you. I didn't know because I was removed from it, but I was told about it. And he wasn't going to go, no. And the goal was to address the Margate Conservative Party conference, which was in the October. So in August, he started dictating the speech for the Margate conference. And it was a work of such care and thought, and was redone again and again. And in August, he worked at Chartwell. And then, of course, he was Prime Minister. The black boxes were reviving.
But he must have been improving if he was able to do this.
He was improving slowly. Somehow the black boxes were coped with. But thank goodness the recess came quite soon. So that in August he was there at Chartwell doing his speech. And in September he went to Chequers for a cabinet meeting, and then on to Balmoral to spend 24 hours with the Queen. Because as you know, the Prime Minister always visits the Queen in September.
Did you go there?
Yes. In a little back room I sat so that he could do his dictating. He was still thinking about the Margate speech at that time. And then from there, we went to La Capitale in the south of France. He finished the Margate speech and he delivered it. And you remember your family talking.
I remember a lot of drama going on, and was he going to do it, and was it going to work, and all of that.
It was a
They were all very
50-minute
anxious.
speech, and it was brilliant. He was back to his old form. Not a hesitation. He walked all right. He spoke all right.
It probably was very good for him to have that goal that he had to get himself ready for it.
Absolutely.
Tell me, what about his 80th birthday and the Graham Sutherland portrait, which again was greatly portrayed on The Crown? I couldn't understand it on The Crown. They had one whole episode practically of the Graham Sutherland portrait.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, I remember it was Jennie Lee who actually organised. She was she organised this present. Nobody remembers who Jennie Lee is. She was
Bevan's wife, wasn't she?
She was Bevan's wife.
She organised it. I didn't know that.
Yes.
She organised it. It was presumably was meant to give pleasure.
Oh, absolutely, and everyone was thrilled about Graham Sutherland, who was one of the great artists, no doubt. But he had this extraordinary way of working with his sitters. Winston Churchill couldn't possibly have just sat there doing nothing while he was painted. So I remember Graham Sutherland went down to Chartwell to the studio and painted there. And Churchill would dictate the couple of hours in the morning while Graham Sutherland painted. And then I remember Churchill saying very politely to Graham Sutherland, "May I have a look at how you're getting on?" "No," he said, "it's my habit. I don't let my sitters see the painting till it's finished." And the time when it was finished, it was taken to Kenneth Clarke, not the politician Kenneth Clarke, the other Kenneth Clarke. Civilization Kenneth Clarke, to his house. I think Graham Sutherland was getting a bit nervous. And your grandmother, Lady Churchill, went to see it at their, I can't remember the name of their famous house. And she came back, her face absolutely distraught, really. She said, "It's terrible. It's terrible. Winston won't be able to bear it." And he saw it. And there may be many people who think it was a great painting. I thought it was a terrible painting. And one of the things was it made him sitting in a chair. You saw it.
Oh, it was awful, yes. Awful.
You thought it was awful.
Well, I mean, I was young, but I know it was awful, and I know that,
Yeah.
that everyone thought it was awful,
His
and everyone
stomach
gasped.
bulging out.
It was almost like as though his flies were undone.
It's
wasn't
there
it?
his fly. I knew I didn't have to say that, but that's what we all thought. And, door. It was not Winston Churchill.
It was horrible, horrible.
And so, it's fate in the end. But it was, of course, unveiled in Westminster Hall for his birthday. Wonderful gathering. Celia was there.
Yeah, we were
I was there.
Edwina was there.
Edwina, where is Edwina? Can't see her. Oh, hello. Edwina was there.
Can you tell us about typing up that speech for the painting? Because it must have been quite a challenge, that speech.
Yeah.
How long did it take him to
Well, do you know, he hardly spent any time on it at all, which was so unlike him. And he just, he made his usual thanks to the people who had to Jennie Lee and the people who had organised it, and thanked them for their generosity, and this great artist, Graham Southern. It didn't take him all that long. And then, of course, there was the remark, it is an example of modern art. That said it all.
Remarkable one, he said.
A remarkable example
Yes,
of
it's very
modern
good.
art.
Yes. So then, Jane, people often say that he had too much to drink. What do you say to that?
During the 6 years that I worked for him, and remember, I worked at night for him, after dinner, mostly as a lot, I never once saw him the worse for drink. I know when I tell people how much he drank, they think it's quite a lot. But he had a weak whiskey in the morning, which would last from 10 o'clock till lunchtime. It was never refilled. He'd have half a bottle of Port Roger and half a bottle of claret during the day, and that was it. And whiskey and soda at night. But is that a lot to drink?
Well, he also had wine and champagne at night too, didn't he? But
Yes, he did.
but he probably must have had a very strong head.
But you see, now I asked you, who can, having had an incredibly pressured, busy day, and then had dinner, and comes along at 10:30 at night, and is able to dictate till 2 o'clock in the morning, with a clear mind, and marching, and I just described to you these wonderful evenings of dictation at Chartwell. Because the book, I know, was finished by the war memoirs by 1951, but then there were always speeches to prepare, there were boxes to go through, so he would work after dinner doing that, usually speeches. And he would always walk up and down in his sergeant suit, lovely velvet sergeant suit, and speaking the words as he felt them. And he would dictate to me straight onto the typewriter. I'd have the typewriter on a table in the corner of the study at Chartwell, and he'd dictate straight to me, and I'd type. And I remember there were sometimes, not always, he'd like to play at the radiogram. And you know, a radiogram takes 6 records. These were music hall songs and wartime songs that he favoured and that he was fond of. And so I'd put on the 6 records, and I knew the moment would come when I'd have to turn them over, and I'd be typing. So what was the solution? So I always put as number 6, and she was an admiral's daughter, but her bathing suit never got wet. And I just thought that was such a lovely record. And so when we got to that, I leapt from my chair, turned them over, and there'd be a gap in the typing. But he never said a word. He'd just sit with it, go to bed, and fill it in himself. And then about 2 o'clock in the morning, there was this magic word he used to say, soup. And he'd have jellied consomme soup, which I'd go and fetch from the pantry, because everyone had gone to bed by then. And he'd eat his soup and go to bed.
And so then you left to get married, is that right?
Yes.
And did you stay in touch after that?
Yes, I did. I left April, and he stood down as Prime Minister, and there was another election. And I stayed in touch with your families. They were so sweet. You've all been so wonderful to me. And my marriage did not last very long. I had my small son, Justin, to bring up. And I had other jobs. But at his birthday, I always used to go into Hyde Park Gate to help with the huge number of letters and posts and goodwill. He's so deeply loved by everybody, you see.
Well, Jane, I think just to finish, and I'm going to say thank you very much before you finish, because that is, and you've been wonderful. I'm so pleased you came. I'm so sorry about your Esther, that I didn't get to your visa.
Celia.
This terrible thing that I didn't get
This
Jane
is the
her.
modern
I
world.
arranged her whole visit absolutely perfectly, but she got to the airport and she didn't have the Esther, which is like the visa waiver, to get in, so she was delayed by a day. So I've spent a whole day sort of
And poor Celia
self-flagellating
Oh,
for
you
it.
shouldn't, because I've had such a wonderful
But
time.
thank you so much. But would
Wonderful.
you just finish by telling us what your enduring memories are?
I would love to, Celia. Will you forgive me? I've been thinking about it. They are so precious that I've written it down. I'll just read it very slowly. It's very short. He was sometimes exhausting, but he was exhilarating to serve at close quarters. That wayward, romantic, expansive, and extraordinarily humane genius. It was the most extraordinary way to have spent the 6 years of my life, and I am so lucky.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much.
I don't think there'll be questions. No questions, I don't think.
Well, I told you that was going to be a special treat. That's going to be a conference memory for the ages. Thank you very much, Lady Williams.
Thank you so much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, some quick housekeeping items. Our book signing session is about to begin in the Petite Salon, immediately adjacent to this room. That will go on for 1 hour. And then the reception for dinner this evening will also take place in the Petite Salon. That will begin at 6:30, and the dinner will be in this room at 7:30. So the hotel staff got a lot of work to do in this room, and we'll see you then. Thank you.